All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Hawk Droppings. I'm recording this on Sunday, March 10th. Daylight savings kicked in today. That's my absolute favorite thing of the year, because that tells me that the next several months it's going to be light out later in the day, and that just helps my mood. But we're not going to talk about daylight savings today. Today, we're going to talk about white Christian nationalism. And this was inspired a few weeks ago by somebody in the comments of one of my videos. Was just like, what the hell is this? What is white Christian nationalism? So it's like, just think of it as like the worst smoothie that you've ever had in your life, because the only ingredients are Jesus, right-wing politics, racism, sexism, homophobia, and bigotry. That's, yeah, with, some supremacy and superiority in there for, texture. A governing philosophy behind white Christian nationalism in the United States in 2024 is, you don't get to tell me what I can do in my life, but I get to tell all of you how to live your lives, because God told me that I'm allowed to do that. And I don't know if it's people who actually truly really believe that, or if they just want power. I read through a lot of stuff, and I read through a lot of interviews in getting ready to do this episode. And like, the psychological component of it is still a little bit of a mystery to me. I don't know if it's people who just feel so incredibly inadequate in their own lives that they feel they have to control the lives of others. Or, it's like the kind of like the billionaire thing, where it's like, somebody becomes worth $10 billion, and then they're not going to be happy unless they're worth $100 billion. And then they have to become worth $200 billion. And it just becomes like this pathology that takes over their entire existence. So the psychology of it still eludes me a little bit. It could be that it's just dumb people. What do I know? But, when you combine these things of, like, I'm not going to talk about it during this episode. I'm going to talk about some other things. Maybe I'll come back and do a separate episode on this later on. But if you want to go down a rabbit hole, look up the Seven Mountains Mandate, and that'll give you some further insight. But one of the things that I was very interested in, because it's like, I remember when I was a kid. So I was 12 years old in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. And so, I remember when Jimmy Carter was the president, when I was between like 8 years old and 12 years old. I had written Jimmy Carter a letter. I got a letter back from him, like actually signed by him. I did the same thing with Gerald Ford for some reason. I don't know why I did either of those things. But, I did have memories of Jimmy Carter as president pretty explicitly being a Christian person, a Christian, a Southern Christian man in the United States of America, and having the impression that he was very devout in his Christian beliefs. And then I remember, during the 1980 campaign, I remember, like Ronald Reagan and the Christian right just kind of coming together. And, I think it was during his campaign that, we saw just the marriage of the Republican Party and conservative Christians. And so one of the things that I was most curious about in some of the research that I was doing for this episode is, I was like, how did this get started? How did it get started? And what I learned kind of surprised me, because it's like, the older, over the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years of my life, I always just assumed that the main spark behind starting and germinating and growing what is today's conservative Christian movement, which has morphed into white Christian nationalism over the last several years under Donald Trump. I always assumed that the first, kind of seed that got all that stuff going was the Roe versus Wade decision legalizing abortion from the Supreme Court in 1973. I was wrong in that. It wasn't until 1979, 6 years after the decision came out in Roe, that Catholics and evangelicals got together in their opposition to abortion and kind of formed this conservative Christian movement that a year later, with the campaign of Ronald Reagan, gave us the marriage that we have today between the Republican Party and conservative evangelical Christianity that we have today. As with so many other things over the history of the United States of America, it turns out the real answer was racism. Yeah, it was racism the whole time. And I found one good article in Politico that gave a really good history in this. And it started with the decision, the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which essentially it's like you can't have desegregated public schools in the United States of America anymore. And, like Dwight Eisenhower was president and he sent the National Guard into various states to force them to desegregate their schools. And one thing that I read in May of 1969, so essentially throughout the South, especially, what communities and churches started doing was opening these things called Segregation Academies. They were private religious schools that were essentially exempt from a lot of the regulations that publicly funded schools funded with tax dollars, were obligated to follow. And they did this specifically to avoid desegregations, to avoid their little white kids having to go to school with little black kids. It was the 50s and the 60s in the South. What can you say? It was a really, really gross time in American history. But, so Brown v. Board of Education hits in the mid 50s. And then, in 1964 and 65, we get the Civil Rights Act, we get the Voting Rights Act, and it's becoming less and less and less as, by the time we get to the mid to late 70s, it's much less socially acceptable to just be openly racist in a disgusting manner. And I'm gonna skip around here a little bit, but because that's originally how people like Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell and some of those kind of first conservative religious leaders went at it. The segregation of schools, and we'll talk about Bob Jones University in a minute as well. And then they realized, oh, we can't be openly racist anymore. Oh God, we got to find something else. And they found abortion. And they found abortion, and that became their unifying thing. But I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear that the racism never went away. The racism was always there, and it's still there today. And how do I know it's still there today? Critical race theory. Who's losing their minds over this boogeyman of critical race theory in K through 12 schools that has never been taught in any K through 12 school ever in the United States of America? Yeah, the term critical race theory is the new N-word for evangelical Christians and white Christian nationalists. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes as well. So in May 1969, a group of African-American parents in Holmes County, Mississippi, sued the Treasury Department, of all entities, because the Treasury Department had been granting tax-exempt status to white-only K through 12 private Christian academies, these so-called segregation academies. A court issued a decision that said, yeah, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that. Schools in general, be them private or public, cannot discriminate based on race. And the schools had been founded in the mid-1960s in response to the desegregation of public schools set in motion by the Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1964. So in 1969, the first year of actual desegregation, the number of white students enrolled in Holmes County, Mississippi, where this lawsuit was filed, dropped from 771 to 28. The following year, that number fell to zero. Zero. But it was 1970 and it was Mississippi. So there's that. And so then the courts, and it was affirmed a year later by the United States District Court for Washington, D.C., that said, under the Internal Revenue Code, properly construed, racially discriminatory private schools are not entitled to federal tax exemption provided for charitable educational institutions, and persons making gifts to such schools are not entitled to deductions provided in case of gifts to such charitable education institutions. Here's the crazy thing. In specifically in this marriage between the Republican Party and conservative Christians and everything that comes along with them, their networks of churches and organizations and whatnot, the GOP was basically, they started treating these churches as a political arm of the party, and every single thing that these churches did was tax deductible. They weren't taxed on the money they raised. They weren't taxed on the money they spent. Everything they did was arguably religious activity and exempt from taxation. And we don't have anything even remotely close to the equivalent of that anywhere on the left. So that brings us into the 70s. And in 1973, there were some folks on the right, that conservative Christians, who were very upset about these court decisions and what the IRS was doing. And a guy that we're going to talk about a lot was this guy named Paul Weyrich, who he was a co-founder of the Heritage Foundation in the 70s, very conservative Catholic, and couldn't figure out how he was the guy who first had the vision. Paul Weyrich was the guy who first had the vision of conservative Christians becoming a political organization or a political movement in the United States. But he couldn't get the groups together. He was a Catholic, didn't know how to get Baptists on board or evangelicals. And in fact, in 1973, when the Roe versus Wade decision came out, the Southern Baptist Convention endorsed it. They endorsed women's rights to choose, one of the largest religious organizations, entities in the United States. They endorsed the Roe versus Wade decision. And nobody was upset about Roe versus Wade on a large scale for the next 5 or 6 years. It just was like, okay, the court decided this, that's fine. And it's like, but Weyrich wanted wanted to bring evangelicals on board so that he would have the numbers to start an actual movement that would have some clout because of its size. And in the decades following World War II, evangelicals had largely stayed out of organized politics. If he could change that, then the combined numbers would constitute a pretty formidable voting bloc. And he wrote about this quite a bit in the mid-70s. The new political philosophy must be defined by conservatives in moral terms, packaged in non-religious language, and propagated throughout the country by our new coalition. When political power is achieved, the moral majority will have the opportunity to recreate this great nation. The leadership, moral philosophy, and workable vehicle are at hand, just waiting to be blended and activated. If the moral majority acts, results could well exceed our wildest dreams. And he gained some headway with these court decisions that didn't allow segregated religious schools. One of the first people that he kind of hooked up with who was upset about this was Jerry Falwell. And in the late 70s, Jerry Falwell complained that in some states, it's easier to open a massage parlor than a Christian school. And there was one school called Bob Jones University that explicitly was like, we don't admit African-American students. This is a whites-only university, period. And the IRS went after him for years and years and years. And finally, I think it was in 1976, took away their tax-exempt status. And so then Bob Jones and Falwell, originally argued that racial segregation was mandated in the Bible, much more so Bob Jones. But then Falwell and Paul Weyrich quickly shifted that from the Bible endorses racism to you're preventing us from the free expression of our religious freedom. And one thing that I've said in many, many, many of my TikToks, when people come at you with the phrase religious freedom, they are always leaving off the two most important words. What are those two words? As is explicitly evidenced here, the religious freedom to discriminate, whether it's against African Americans or immigrants or women or the LGBTQ community. It is the religious freedom to discriminate against others. And so Bob Jones loses their tax exempt status in 1976. That's the year of the campaign in which Jimmy Carter gets elected and sworn in January of 1977. And the conservative Christian movement had greatly assisted Jimmy Carter in that election because he was a Christian. And the church hadn't, polarized itself yet. That was going to happen 4 or 5 years later. And it wasn't explicitly aligned with one party or another. Abortion rights was not a thing for conservative Christians in 1976. And, hanging your hat on, we should be able to have all white religious schools and have them be tax exempt was not working anymore with most of the country. So these guys were kind of in limbo during Jimmy Carter's pregnancy, but then along comes Ronald Reagan. And it's crazy because in 1967, when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, that was 6 years before the Roe versus Wade decision. So there was no constitutional right to abortion in 1967. Ronald Reagan signed into law as governor of California the most liberal abortion bill in the country. He made abortion legal in California in 1967. Yeah. Run that one past your Republican relatives who, still have a photo of Ronald Reagan on their wall. if they still even exist. But there were a couple of scholars and a couple of activists who started working very hard on the issue of abortion because they believed that it was, the scourge of American society, and that any society that countenanced abortion was captive to secular humanism and therefore caught in a vortex of moral decay, which would eventually destroy that society. And Paul Weyrich was partially responsible for funding these guys who were pushing this issue. And then then it kind of dawned on him that he saw that as an issue that, if framed correctly, could bring evangelicals around to the point where they would be willing to become politically active as a voting bloc. And so that's what he began working on. And over the course of 1979 and 1980, he had great success with that. And then by that point, 13 years after Reagan signed that bill as governor of California, by the time he's running for president, he's pro-life. He's pro-life, he's pro-Christian, and, God and country and that whole thing. And so this new group, this new coalition that Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell and Billy Graham were putting together threw all of their weight behind Ronald Reagan, who went on to win the presidency. And Jerry Falwell, of course, took credit for that. And then we were off to the races, because then, by 1980, the marriage between the Republican Party and conservative Christianity as it existed back then was a done deal. Done. Over. Yep, we're a team now. We're on the same team. And one of the other things that I did for this episode, I went out and I found interviews with some authors who had written some books on this subject. One of the guys, there was a book I read recently. It's called The Undertow. It's by a guy named Jeff Sharlet, Sharlet. Scenes from a Slow Civil War, the intersection of right-wing politics and religion. He went out on the road. He's a reporter. He went out on the road for 2 years during Donald Trump's administration in rural America, not cities. He was out in rural America, and he was interviewing people and getting to know people and going to rallies and things like that. And the book that he wrote, I'm going to read this from part of a review. It's an attempt to understand how over the past decade, religion has morphed into delusion, social division into distrust into paranoia, and hatred into fantasies involving violence. Yeah. Just add politics and nationalism, and there you go. It's an extremely fascinating book, and he talks a lot about, it, like almost kind of the dishonesty of the presentation of religious leaders to their congregations of what they're really trying to do. And, just saying, well, we're just trying to go back when America was great, go back to make America great again, when it's actually moving forward towards authoritarianism. America has been a lot of things in the past, but it has never, ever, ever been an authoritarian nation. And that is explicitly what the white Christian nationalist movement wants now. And they want that through Donald Trump and his, hopefully will never occur, re-election later this year. They kind of paint it in pictures of, going back to that old time religion as a way to sort of almost manipulate their followers over time and push them and push them and push them and push them until their followers are like, yes, this white Christian nationalist thing with all of its racism and xenophobia and intolerance, every single thing that Jesus Christ is 100% against. This is where we're at now as a political movement. And this is what we want to do. It's a vast movement across the nation of this country. It's evolving currently. And as I said, over the last several years, it's added this element of nationalism, which is not just that, America's the greatest country on earth. It bumps that up a notch to the United States of America is ordained by God as a white Christian nation, which, if you can find that for me in the Bible, I'd be super curious. If somebody can find that in the Bible for me, I'll read it live on a TikTok. If there's a verse in there that's somewhere where Jesus was like, yeah, by the way, the United States of America is ordained by my dad to be a white Christian nation. If somebody can point me to that verse, I'm all over it. I'll read it. I'll read it every day. But so it's like the interesting thing about Jeff Charlotte's book, it's like he's going through all of this stuff. Let me check here. I have it. I have his book right here. I just wanted to see what the publication date is. And Jeff Charlotte's written a whole bunch of other really good books too. So he published his book in 2023. So it's like by then, January 6th had already happened. And so that becomes a big part of his book. And, it's like you see the evangelicals and the nationalism and the conservative Christians, and they all glom on to Donald Trump like really early on in 2016. Because they, like Donald Trump, are also transactional. Okay. God has selected this imperfect vessel for us in Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is going to give us what we want. He is going to give us the court justices we want. He's going to give us policies. He's going to take away protections for the LGBTQ community. He's going to give us religious freedom to discriminate. This is our guy. He could not possibly be more opposite than Jesus Christ, but he's going to give us what we want. And so they supported him right out of the gate. And he did. And then you started seeing at Trump rallies, and then you started seeing at religious rallies, evangelical rallies, American flags at church rallies. And then you started seeing Gadsden flags, the Don't Tread on Me flags, and Confederate flags. And then we graduated to all Black American flags. I don't know if I learned about these on TikTok. All Black American flags. So it's got the same pattern, the stars and bars, but they're all black. And first time I saw one of those, I was like, what the hell is that? And it's a Civil War era thing that basically you're flying that. You are telling people around you that we are not going to abide by the rules of war. We are not going to show any mercy or pity whatsoever to opposing forces that we encounter. We are not going to take anyone prisoner. We will show those fighting troops no quarter and we will kill them. And the phrase no quarter means pity or mercy. And, it's like, and a lot of this stuff kind of grew out of like prosperity gospel in the 50s and the 60s, where it's like, if you pray enough to God and you do, you tithe enough to your church or your pastor, then God, keeps a ledger apparently, and will, bestow upon you enough money so that you can buy that new Cadillac. I don't know. But then it's like Trump gets elected and, we start seeing the white Christian nationalism really take hold with Trump, because how did he launch his campaign? He launched his campaign coming down his little golden escalator and immediately going after immigrants from south of the border. That's the nationalism component. We got to protect our borders, because And I, I remember when I was a kid, going to Sunday school and reading in church and reading the Bible. I remember just the sheer number of Bible lessons we had when I was a kid, in which we read all of the quotes that demonstrated very clearly how important borders were to Jesus Christ. I'm kidding. If anybody can send me those Bible quotes too, where Jesus is like, "Hey, we need a secure border. we got to tighten up that border, guys." It's like they just invent this shit, they just invent it out of nowhere. It's like Jesus is now, like, Republican Jesus in 2024 is a hyper masculine, blonde-haired, blue-eyed bodybuilder who carries an AR-15 and rides into battle on a Tyrannosaurus Rex. That's 2024 Republican Jesus. And he hates immigrants. He loves borders. He hates the LGBTQ community. And he really thinks that women should stay in their place. I just, where did this come from? Where did this come from? I don't get it. But, it's like leading up to, over the course of Trump's presidency, it's like everything just kind of morphs and you get this lions, not lambs thing, which really took hold during COVID, and all the people who refused to wear masks and refused to get vaccinated because they're lions and not lambs being led to slaughter. And, and it's like, it, like the prosperity gospel morphs into this like war theology. And, during COVID, it's like, we're at war with people who want us to wear masks and get vaccinated. I don't know, man. But so leading up, it was fascinating to read about some of the stuff that, especially around the 2020 election. And I don't know that a lot of people realize this, but there was an absolutely massive white Christian nationalist presence at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. People carrying crosses. There was all kinds of Christian ideology and Christian imagery and Christian nationalist imagery. I mean, it's like, you remember I think his name was Jacob Chansley, something like that. The QAnon shaman with the red and white paint on his face and the furry helmet with the horns, and that guy. I mean, it's like when he and his buddies made their way onto the floor of the United States Senate, they started praying. They started praying to Jesus, and they started praying to Jesus about the United States of America and Jesus saving the United States of America by overturning an election. I don't know. I mean, God slept through 250 years of slavery. He slept through 350 years of the slaughter of tens of millions of Native Americans in this country. He took a nap throughout the entire Holocaust. But in 2024, or in 2020, God cares who's president of the United States. Give me a break. And if you pray hard enough and donate to your pastor, like I said, God will most definitely give you the money that you need to buy that new Cadillac. So some of these these Christian nationalist organizations, starting in December of 2020, so in between the election and election, or in between election and inauguration day, they started holding these things in Washington, D.C. that they called Jericho marches. And it goes back to a Bible verse, Joshua 1:9, where God told Joshua to go into Jericho and kill every single man, woman, and child inside, kill them all. And these folks were holding Jericho marches inside Washington, D.C. in the weeks leading up to Inauguration Day. Yeah, it's cosplay until it's not. It's very, it's very Old Testament. It's very vengeance related, their philosophies. And I can already tell I'm only going to get halfway through. I'm not even going to get halfway through this stuff that I want to talk about in this episode. So maybe I'll do a part 2 for this next week. Because I do want to go see. I do want to go see. Rob Reiner just put out a new movie. Director of Spinal Tap put out a new documentary called God and Country, which is about white Christian nationalism. And I haven't been able to see that yet. I want to watch that. So I'll just do this right now. So this is going to be part 1 of white Christian nationalism, and I will do part 2 next week. And in between, I'm going to try to go see that movie. And I've got a whole bunch of other materials that I want to talk about too. So we'll do it that way. And so it's like, and in his book, Jeff Charlotte goes back through some of the history in a little more detail than a couple of the other articles that I read. And, they have this thing every year in Washington, D.C. called the National Prayer Breakfast, which I always thought was pretty innocuous. It's like, okay, the president and members of Congress get together and they have breakfast with Christians, and, they chit chat and they have speakers and they pray and whatever. It's explicitly a Christian nationalist movement. And because Christian nationalism is such a Caucasian activity in the United States in 2024, I think we can safely say that it's a white Christian nationalist event now. At the National Prayer Breakfast in 1968, Billy Graham, in 1968, God, think back to what was going on in the United States in 1968. Vietnam protests. We just had the Summer of Love in San Francisco. We had hippies. Tom Powell Jr. is out there in San Francisco eating acid every other day. That's a joke. I'm kidding. Tom's my buddy. He knows that. The Grateful Dead's doing their thing, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, but there's this massive shift in the culture, and it was generational. And, free love was becoming a thing, and people were protesting a war that the United States had fought. You think back to World War I, World War II. There was nobody in the United States who was protesting those wars. There may have been, but it was nothing that constituted some kind of wide scale movement. Korean War, who knows? I don't know anything about the Korean War, to be honest with you. But then the Vietnam War hits, and it's like massive, massive, massive protests for years of young people and religious groups actually protesting the Vietnam War. That had never happened in the United States of America before. And you have all these other cultural changes going on too, man. And so in 1968, Billy Graham, who was very concerned about all of these things, shows up at the National Prayer Breakfast. And he says, Jesus said, I come not to bring peace, but the sword. Which, okay. Was Jesus passing out? Did Jesus have enough swords for everybody? Was he sharing, or did he only have one sword and he was keeping it all to himself? Because if you're Jesus and you're gonna show up and say something like that, somebody's gonna be like, dude, you just gave all of those people bread and wine and fish. Are you showing up here with only one sword? But say I come not to bring peace, but the sword, and you only bring one sword. So it's like you start seeing like the germination of, overt Christianity with government. And then, you got these religious figures coming and saying, I think we should focus more on the sword than on peace. It's like that just gets dicey, man. It just gets dicey. It gets super dicey, and it ends up with where we're at today. And now, it's like they used to hold the National Prayer Breakfast at like a big conference room somewhere or something. Well, Mike Johnson moved it into the Capitol Rotunda this year, right up there, all out in front. It's now an explicitly Christian nationalist event. and with all of its weirdly homoerotic machismo and imagery. And now it's like, especially after COVID, I mean, all of this stuff was turbocharged during COVID because everything got shut down. All kinds of gatherings were shut down by, quote, the government, unquote. And one of the guys that I want to talk about, he's an author named Tim Alberta, who grew up evangelical, has written a lot. And I've heard many, many interviews with him where it's like, there were a lot of religious leaders and a lot of religious groups, and evangelicalism as a whole took that as the government is trying to make our religious activities illegal by trying to shut us down. This is how the government's going to do it. And took it as a direct attack on their religious beliefs, totally setting aside that there were legitimate health concerns with large gatherings of people not wearing masks indoors. And it radicalized a lot of these groups throughout the country. And you started seeing things like, there was that guy from up in Reading, I think his name is Sean Fuchs, something or other, really long curly hair. That guy he refused. People like him refused. He kept having his huge gatherings. And, by a year and a half, 2 years after COVID started, he went from kind of a backbencher in northern rural California to, now he's massive crowds. He's touring the country. He's bringing in $5, $6, $7, $8, $9 million because he stood up to the government for Jesus, kind of thing. And, north of Sacramento, I think like in 50, 60 miles north of Sacramento, we have a church up there that is explicitly a militia church. In their weekly calendar, they have militia training now. And it's completely radicalized. I'm glad I'm running out of time because there's so much more that I want to talk about. I'm very much looking forward to doing a part 2. And, and it's like we see, today, it's like, are we going to fund Ukraine? And like, there's so many people on the right now that are looking at Vladimir Putin as their ideal, a white Christian ethno-state where there's zero immigration and it's basically illegal to be a member of the LGBTQ community, and the LGBTQ community has no rights in Russia. That's what they want. They always forget the part that Russia doesn't have a constitution or a Bill of Rights, and therefore Russia doesn't have a Second Amendment. You don't have the right to own 97 guns in Russia. You don't have the right to own one. But they love that strong man, official religion for the state. There's no immigration. There's no LGBTQ rights. Everybody knows their place. And if you step out of line, Alexei Navalny. And, it's what Erdogan is doing in Turkey. And, it's the same thing that the leaders are doing in Iran for the last 44 years. The explicit coupling of government, religion, and theocratic authoritarianism. That's what's driving today's white Christian nationalist movement. Authoritarian, theocratic, religious government with a near dictator in power. It's absolutely terrifying to think about. But you also have to have, the one key ingredient in this stuff, and that stuff that I was just talking about with, churches during COVID, there has to be an other. And for them, the other was the government. And, when the government's not doing something like that, the other that they have can be immigrants. It can be the LGBTQ community. It can be women. There's always an other. There's always an enemy. There's always something or someone who is responsible for all of the bad things that are happening in your life, that if you could just control that group or that thing, then everything in your life would be better. And it's like you couple all of these things with God, and then you find yourself in a holy war. It's not just right versus left and we disagree with each other. It becomes a holy war for your very existence, because of the others, because you're good. You have God on your side, so you're good. So therefore the other side is evil and wants to kill you and is trying to destroy you and is trying to destroy America. So it becomes an existential holy war. But thank God, you have little baby Jesus on your side, who's fighting there with you every step of the way, riding into battle on his Tyrannosaurus Rex with his AR-15. So with that, I'm going to close out this episode. We're going to pick up part 2 next week. I want to thank everybody for listening. As always, please go to, the audio of this podcast is available free every week. And I want to remind everybody that we have several other podcasts that we put out each week. We put out 5 episodes each week. You can find those at hawkpodcasts.com. If you're listening to this audio only, you can go to hawkpodcasts.com and see the video versions of our podcasts. And I've got a YouTube page. And as always, we have a merch store at hawkmerchstore.com. As always, a massive thank you to my brother Falcon, without whom none of this would be possible. And our buddy Wiseacre for his amazing graphics. And my brother from another mother, my buddy Anu, for letting us use his music for the intros and the outros. So I hope everybody has a good and safe week. 2 weeks from tomorrow, Donald Trump's first criminal trial starts. He will have to be in the courtroom every single day that court is in session. And so start your week with that happy thought. Be safe, be well, and I will see you soon. Thank you.